Right, let's move on. And the United Nations' newest Goodwill Ambassador, Judd, has told me that she wants to try to end violence against women in all its forms. Earlier this week, the actor and activist was appointed in the role by the United Nations Population Fund. I sat down with her and the executive of the director of the Unfpa, Babatunde Oshotimen, and asked why in 2016 girls were still being forced into child marriage.
Thank you for having us, and you make the perfect point. It's related to structural inequality. So there's a persistent attitudinal norm that a girl's sexuality needs to be protected. So that's one of the push factors. So she's forced into a marriage to which she has neither consented, about which she hasn't been informed, and obviously against her will. And then within that so-called union, I don't call sex a child marriage sex, I call it rape. Her sexual integrity and bodily autonomy is routinely violated. So I appreciate the fact that you would bring it up, and it's, as we discussed very simply and plainly, it's completely unacceptable, and it absolutely is linked to poverty. It's linked to lack of universal access to quality primary and secondary education.
Well, as a UN Goodwill Ambassador, what do you hope to achieve?
Eradication of all forms of gender-based violence.
I mean, it's almost, when you try and get your head around how many people are affected on a day-to-day basis, a lot of work needs to be done. What kind of tools do you have to get eradication going?
We have tools. There is global legislation, there is national legislation, there is local legislation. What we do and what we continue to do is to work with communities to make sure that we can make them accept and sustain, the abandonment of these things. And that's what Ashley is so qualified to do, because as a global citizen and knowing many of the parts of the world and being able to go there and say, this is not acceptable.
Well, let's take a look at the likes of sub-Saharan Africa, where you see it still being relatively prevalent. What's interesting to note is that you're seeing a lot of more women being involved in government, and a lot more ministers that are female. But yet on the ground, it's a very different story when it comes to land rights, when it comes to access and so forth. What kind of progress do you foresee within this space?
Well, again, I think you make a very good point, because the solutions are universal and they're holistic. Every part of the social structure has to be included. There needs to be legislation, and that legislation needs to be enforced. We need to end impunity, so child brides have access to justice. And then when they have access to justice, they need social support. They need livelihood skill acquisition. And also, of course, if we economically empower boys and men, they are less likely to try to access a child bride as a source of cheap labor and as the source of reproduction for creating more cheap labor.
Dr. Babatunde, when we look at the growth rates across Africa, when we look at the growth rates around the world, we're seeing some numbers increasing. However, you've got inequality which is increasing in tandem to this. Let's talk about the demographic dividend. Let's talk about how we can actually bridge that gap so we can start eradicating the very serious issues that we're talking about.
The inequality you talk about is global. The inequality in Africa is stark. And so, in a sense, what Ashley's just talked about is probably the most important entry point. Working with adults and girls, making sure they go to school, they stay in school, they're educated, they have skills, they can make choices in their lives. If you do that, what you're going to have is that you will have families that rights are rights-based, and then you will have communities in which you'll have women who will be empowered to make changes happen. And now, you can then translate that into national system or subnational systems. So it is about education, 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 and empowerment of women and girls. That's where it's going to come from.
Air travel is a lot of